Hi, this is Cheryl with the Cut at Home Design Team. I'm here this morning with a fun faux tile technique for you to use. I know a lot of people are considering what to do for their holiday cards this year already, and not a lot of the new stuff is out, so I thought I would show you some uses for stamps that you already have, stamps that you may have used last year. So this is a penny black cling stamp. It's called, oh dear, I can never remember this, Happy Holly. It's a beautiful stamp and it's so versatile. It can be used in a lot of different ways. I think you've seen a post on this one from me already. But here I'm using the faux tile technique. I love how this turns out. Again, it's so very different from other things that you may have done with this stamp before that it almost makes it unrecognizable. So super easy card to create. First thing I did was to stamp my image on a 5x7 piece of cardstock. I knew I wanted to do the 5x7 card. I wasn't quite sure what size my center panel would be, so I started with the 5x7 so that I knew I would have plenty to work with regardless of what I decided on. So first thing I did, I used my Versamark ink for this, black Versamark. I wasn't quite sure if I would watercolor this, so I didn't want to use anything that would react with water. I used my Tim Holtz Distress markers, my peeled paint, and my fired brick to color this in. Again, just a simple green on the leaves, red for the berries, and I'm done. That's one of the things I love about this stamp set. It's so pretty, and with just a minimal effort you get a really nice result with it. So my next step was to decide what sort of panel made sense with this. So again, my thought when looking at it is it would be best to isolate on this particular part of the stamp, because that would fit nice and long and tall on a 5x7 card, and I'm not losing too much by covering this part over. So I began to cut. Again, where do you start with something like this? I started by trimming at the bottom, then I saw what made sense at the top. When I know that I'm going to make these faux tile cards, I'm looking for something to make it easy for me. What's a simple cut for the pieces? So I ended up with 5¼ inches tall. That's 1.75 inches times 3. So my pieces are 1.75 inches tall, all of them. Once I did that, so my next step was to just trim this off at 5¼ Then I trimmed this edge off a little bit, and again I tried to think about whether I wanted those panels to be square or a little bit rectangular. I decided on the little bit rectangular, so my width this way is 3 inches, giving me panels, these little panels that are now 1½ inches wide and 1¾ inches tall. So I just simply, again, cut the strip from the side here as close as I could to these leaves, and then I trimmed this so that this is 3 inches across. This is what I ultimately ended up with. If I didn't tell you, of course you want to color it first. Make sure you've got the colors in. It's much harder to color the little thing than it is the big thing. So use your distress markers, color this in, and then trim it down to size. Be sure and keep those little edges though. This will be useful for something. So just set it aside. You'll know when it's the right usage, and you can just pull it out and you've got something ready made to go. Now at this point we want to work on the tile. There's a couple of different ways that you can do that. One is to simply work with this full panel and trim it later. Another alternative is to cut the pieces now and work with individual cut pieces to turn it into the faux tile. Either one works just as well. So let me show you on this. I'm just going to grab this little piece here. Once you cut, you need to mark the back. So I know this is 2C, row 2, the last one down. Even though it should be pretty easy with only 6 pieces to figure out where things go, with stamps, it can be really, really impossible. And the last thing you want to do is finish a card and realize something's upside down. So in any event, I've got my little cut piece here. I'm going to cover it with Versamark. So I'm just going to lay this on the Versamark pad and make sure that it's well covered. I'm not really going to do it now, but if I were, I would just lay it on that pad, cover it well. And then I'm going to put it on a piece of scratch paper and cover over the top with this ultra thick embossing powder, clear from Ranger. You can use your regular clear embossing powders, but you're going to have to repeat this process again and again and again to build up enough powder to give you this faux tile finish. So with the ultra thick embossing powder, 1 or 2 times is usually enough. For this one I had to do 3, but I had something a little funky going on, and I'll explain that to you in just a minute. So we've covered it over with the Versamark. We're going to put it on a piece of scratch paper, cover it over with the embossing enamel, and then we're going to heat it and melt that powder. For melting, I really like this Ranger Heat It tool, much better than any other heat embossing tool I've ever used. It has low airflow. There is some air coming out, but it's low airflow so that your powder isn't blowing all over the place. It's less likely to burn than many of the other units that I've used, and it just gives a really nice result. So again, if you're in the market for a new one, I would really recommend the Ranger Heat It Craft tool. But you're going to melt that powder until you have this smooth, almost glass-like surface. You're not going to see bubbles and lumps and that sort of thing. You may see that on your first attempt. It just means you have to add more of the ultra thick embossing powder and melt it some more. Like I said, for this one I had to go 3 times. Now when you're ready to add more powder, more of the embossing powder to melt the second time, you can do one of 2 things. First of all, you could just add more Versamark so that the powder sticks, or you could make sure that your panel is already heated from the melting process, and if it's still wet and sticky, then the new powder will stick to it. So either way, this paper is kind of thin, so it dried really, really fast. I had to use the Versamark method, but when I did a different card, I was able to just use the warm embossing enamel to hold more in place, and 2 was more than enough with this. Like I said, it took 3. So you just do whatever it takes. It will get to that glassy finish. It's a matter of having enough of the embossing enamel on it. So whether you're doing one little panel or whether you're doing the entire big panel, same process, same timing. Obviously this, I have to work on one area and move around the design and that sort of thing, but it's not difficult. I find it much easier to work with the one big piece and then deal with, cut it up and that sort of thing, rather than trying to hang on to these things. This gets hot. There is quite a bit of enamel. If you use tweezers or something to try and hold it, you'll have tweezer indents in your project and that sort of thing. Another reason why I like the Ranger tool is because I can just set my project on the table and use it this way, and it's not been a problem for me. So we're going to do whichever process, the little pieces, the bigger piece, and we're going to make that tile. If I've done the bigger piece, my next step is going to be to cut it apart. I normally cut down the center first and then cut my 3 pieces. Again, I want to be very careful right away to label them all so I know which piece goes where. And then once that's done with this big panel, I'm going to reheat all of the little pieces again. You could have some potential cut lines and sharp edges from doing it all as a big panel and then cutting it apart. But when you put the heat on it and you remelt it a little bit, that enamel just sort of folds over the edges really nice, and you get the same nice finish that you've got here where the enamel doesn't look like it's been cut, it just looks like it's been melted in place. So same result, whether do it this way or this way. It's just what is easier for you. So from there, once whatever you've done, once it's all set, let it rest for about 5 or 10 minutes though. This is pretty thick with the enamel on it. Let it fully dry so that you don't have any issues, any fingerprints, nicks, scratches, whatever. It's just fine, very versatile, but give it that chance. But then it's time to assemble the card. I wanted to do, as I told you, a 5x7 card. So I cut my back layer, the green cardstock 5x7. This pretty plaid you may recognize as Graphic 45 from the 12 Days of Christmas. I love this paper. I'm going to be sorry when I'm out of it. But the plaid I cut 4 3/4 inches by 6 3/4 inches. My gold metallic is 4.5 inches by 6.5 inches. And then my red is cut more to match my panel pieces. My panel size ultimately, as I told you, was 3 inches wide and 5 1/4 inches tall. So the red panel that I made then, I made 3.5 inches wide and 5 3/4 inches tall, so that I would have space to separate the tiles a little bit and a nice border around it. Again, you can plan this any way you want. That's how I planned this particular card. Of course, I added the ribbon and bow at the bottom. My little holly leaves here are from another penny black die. This one's called Red and Greens. It's just a little bit of holly, and so I cut a couple of leaves off, used some red bling there at the corner for my berries, and I'm good to go with this card. Now, one thing I want to point out to you, because I know it's showing somewhat in the video and I know it will show in the finished card, I did get a little bit of a funky result with my Versamark with this thinner paper. It almost looks like there's a grease spot on here. So I'm not quite sure whether the Versamark will dry or settle somehow and that will subside a little bit, or whether that's permanent. I don't like the look. I've done a number of tile cards now and I've not seen that happen. Here's another one that I have, and you just don't have any sign of that. So test your paper. I learned something. Test your paper. See what happens with that Versamark. If it looks like it's going to be problematic, go to a little bit thicker paper, or at least a different one, so you're not dealing with the same thing as me. A beautiful card that has these funky stains on it. Again, my hope is that they will fade with the passage of time, and I'll post a little note for you on the YouTube comments once I've given it about a week to see if this dries and gets better at all. That's my hope. But lesson learned. We all learn those, unfortunately, in the hardest ways. So that's my thought for today. A pretty faux tile card. Another way that you can stretch the stamps that you already have, whether it's for holiday cards or for everyday uses. It's a great idea. I love the result. It just makes a super distinctive card, and your friends will really love receiving it. Thanks for watching. Bye.